2023-24 school year, and this is the Fiscal Basics 2-day training. We want to thank you for joining us today. We know there's so much happening these days, especially around the holidays. And as you know, there's so much around the fiscal components of federal programs as well. We're going to need 2 days to cover all the material. This is kind of like the graphic where you're drinking from a fire hose. And so we want to make sure that you have time to digest it and be able to ask questions. Day 2 will be after the Thanksgiving holiday on Wednesday, November 28th, at the same time as today, 3 to 4:30. So let's get started. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat, and also you can find it on the slide presentation. It will take you to our Canvas page, and here you'll be able to find the presentation if you hit the presentation icon, as well as the recording and the Q&A once we post it here. Again, once we send out the Q&A, you'll also find it here posted. In addition to our presentation, we have additional resources to support your work with the fiscal oversight of your federal programs. We're finishing up. Right now, we're in the final stages of the updating of our fiscal fundamental guide and time and effort reporting materials. So if you don't have a copy or you would like to get the updated materials, you can purchase these 2 resources, and you will find the ordering information at the link on the bottom of the slide. So today is day 1, and we will start with an introduction to the federal programs, and then we're going to focus in on the cost allocation terminology, the federal cost principles, the federal timelines, federal cash management, and your internal controls and policies and procedures. And in 2 weeks, we will look at more closely the time and effort reporting. We'll look at the Title I fiscal cornerstones with the maintenance of effort, the comparability of services, and the supplement not supplant. And then we will take a closer look at the equipment and contracts. And then, of course, my personal favorite, federal program monitoring. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any questions that we can, but we definitely will follow up with the written response in a Q&A that will be emailed to everyone who is registered for this 2-day workshop. And then, as noted before, it will be posted on our Canvas page. So let's begin today's session with an introduction to the federal programs. When you receive federal programs, there are legal assurances that were signed, and these agreements are important for you to know and to fully understand, because these are the strings attached to each program. There are regulations that we're going to talk about today, and these regulations are based on the presumption that the LEA is responsible for ensuring the proper use of funds and to ensure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse in your federal programs. This is the foundation to why you must have your system of internal controls in place. Today's purpose and outcomes. The specific purpose of these 2 days is to provide you with an overview of the fiscal requirements, primarily for federal programs, and the source of these legal requirements. Often we get questions, and we always go to the source. We always look at the legal requirement, because that's where you're going to find the detail about what is actually, when rubber hits the road, and what's actually going to stick. So we always go to the sources, but we want everyone here to understand and know those legal requirements that are in the sources. We also want to help you put systems in place in your LEA, especially if you're new, to address these requirements. We want to make sure you are aware of all of the reporting requirements as well, and also clarify some of the differences and similarities between the state and federal program funding requirements. And lastly, we want to help you understand the intersection of the program and fiscal requirements. Many of you here today may be from the program side of the federal programs. However, if you are responsible for state and federal programs, well, many of the requirements you need to keep an eye on include fiscal issues. So it's important that you know that the fiscal requirements, that they are part of your job. As you will see throughout this presentation, it's the fiscal and program requirements that are interrelated. And as always, we say communication between the program and fiscal folks is so critical. So when implementing your federal programs, working as a team is a must. Fiscal staff process payments, but the program staff need to be involved in determining allowability. The fiscal staff may track and report the grant expenditures, but program staff make decisions about the spending and the need to be aware of the timelines. Both program and fiscal staff need to follow the district procedures of purchasing. Program staff need to review the charges to make sure that they are charged the correct program and the program accounts. So, and this is to minimize any risks of the LEA not meeting their oversight responsibility of the public funds. These are some of the documents we will be referencing today. ESSA, which is the current authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is the legal basis for the federal programs. This is also known as the statute. The Uniform Grants Guidance is another name for the Code of Federal Regulations, which includes the requirements for all federal education programs. The CSAM is the California School Accounting Manual, which is the state's guidance for the fiscal accounting and determinations. And the EDGAR. The EDGAR is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. This is the handbook that's based on the Uniform Grants Guidance and provides additional requirements and clarifications for programs operated by the Education Department. There are multiple sources to follow when the rules for federal program funds. Federal programs are typically the most restrictive because the requirements have a specific purpose and use. First is the statute, as stated before. In this case, in the case of most LEA programs, these are contained in the ESSA and are based on legislation. These and all other federal programs are subject to the Code of Federal Regulations or the Uniform Grants Guidance. In some cases, the state law will add additional requirements, so then Ed Code also is another source of legal requirements for some of the federal programs. The Code of Federal Regulations is set forth by the Office of Management and Budget, also known as OMB. And the OMB governs all federal programs, and specifically Part 200 applies to the federal education programs. And EDGAR provides that additional detail on some of these requirements. The California Code of Regulations also should be referred to because this codifies the CDE guidance related to some of the federal and state programs. So let's review some important facts about statute. Statute simply means the law establishing or authorizing the program. Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 are sections of ESSA and describe the program requirements for each of these programs. They typically begin with the intent and the purpose of the statute, which sets the groundwork for the law. This will tell you who is meant to benefit and what is the program meant to accomplish. Some programs include lists of allowable costs or activities, such as the Title III, and include both required and allowable activities. Others, like Title I, provide parameters for determining allowability of costs. So you won't find a list of allowable activities. There usually are parameters that you'll have to determine in order for it to be allowable. The statutes are specific to individual programs. California Education Code also includes some provisions related on federal law, such as the process for developing Title I school-wide plans or school-wide plans. And lastly, the Uniform Grants Guidance, the Code of Federal Regulations, is applicable to all federal education programs. Now, when we take a look at regulations, regulations are developed by the oversight agencies. The rules are codified in the regulations. As explained earlier, the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, is responsible for publishing the regulations for all federal programs. The Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, Section 2, Part 200, includes the regulations for all federal education programs. This is also referred to as the Uniform Grants Guidance, which is the UGG. The Education Department Administrative Regulations, the EDGAR, are based on the Code of Federal Regulations and provide additional detail on certain requirements. So 34 CFR Part 75 addresses direct grants, and Part 76 addresses the state administered programs. Then we also have General Education Provisions Act, which is the GEPA. And so these are regulations governing and enforcing the legal requirements for those stated covered programs. And lastly, we have the California Code of Regulations, the CCR. And this is the codification of the general and permanent rules and regulations announced in the California Regulatory Notice Register by California state agencies under authority from primary legislation in the California codes. So you can see here we have the federal and we have the state regulations, and they're all listed here. And a lot of times when you will ask a question, or if we refer to an answer, we always again go back to what does the legal requirement say and what does the regulations state. So again, we want you to be familiar with all of these different resources. This graphic image has come in handy for a few years now, and it's been very helpful to have people understand the purpose of the funding sources specific to the LCAP, to the SIPSA, and the LCAP Federal Addendum. This model shows how the funding is provided for all through the core program for all students and specific student groups. It also shows how the additional funding is provided to address specific needs and populations, in addition to providing a core program for all students and specific student groups. You see on the bottom, the LCFF base. This is the basic services for all students and ethnic and students with disability student groups to meet the LEA goals in the state priorities. The LCFF supplemental and concentration, this is an additional requirement for those that receive these funds. And here you need to ensure that low-income foster youth and English learner students are receiving increased or improved services in order to meet the LEA's goals and the state priorities. Title II and Title IV are district level programs and funds. Title I are supplemental funds and services for students that are at risk of not meeting the standards in ELA and math. These funds may not include mandated costs. So if it's something that the state requires you to do, you cannot use your Title I funds to pay for this. Title III is the most restrictive of all of these federal programs. It's supplemental funds and services for English learners. So again, this is a helpful way to see how does this all work together in making sure that you use, a lot of times you want to make sure that you use your most restrictive funds for those specific uses and your least restrictive for, obviously the least restrictive. So let's take a look at two basic terms that you'll often hear and we often say, and these are very important to your work: unrestricted and restricted funds. Unrestricted funds refer to the funds that come without legal constraints and can be used for any purpose. This little guy here is happy. He's, throwing around his money. And it's not that these funds can be used for any purpose not prohibited in law for educational agencies. So again, you cannot use it for anything, but definitely more for things that, are unrestricted. Restricted funds, on the other hand, are subject to constraints that may be imposed by the provider of the funds or by legislation. And according to CSAM, if you're using a combination of restricted and unrestricted funds within that program, then you need to account for them, all the funds, as restricted. So again, it's very careful. You have to be careful. So really what that means, and where you see it often, is in time accounting, where you have a combination of multi-funding somebody with restricted and unrestricted. And so that triggers time and effort reporting, because again, that's the restricted component of using restricted funds. So again, it's a good guidance for you to know this up front, so that you can determine if this is the best use of your resources. Unrestricted funds are typically referred to as general funds, and they are LEA's main operating budget. While they are unrestricted, LEAs are subject to requirements and obligations that must be met even with these unrestricted funds. Unrestricted funds are used to implement your core program or your basic services to all your students. And this would include requirements of supporting equity and civil rights requirements, such as ELD. LCFF is a bit of a hybrid program, which explains why it's often confusing. LCFF funds are all unrestricted funds, so they can be used for any cost not prohibited by law. But LEAs also have an obligation to provide increased or improved services for the low-income foster youth and English learners who have generated the additional funds in proportion to the additional funds they generated. And so while the funds taken as a whole are unrestricted in that they can be used for any legally allowable purpose, the obligation for using the supplemental and concentration funds remains. Let's take a look at restricted funds. These are the funds that are constrained by law, regulations, or restrictions that come with the funds by the entity providing the funds. This could include private or community-based organizations, local governments, private donors, state restricted or categorical programs, and as we're talking today, the federal formula and competitive grant programs. So remember I said earlier that there are strings attached to the money. And so how does the state and federal government assure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse happening? It's through the monitoring process. Here are some ways that you will be providing evidence when you participate in any of these monitoring activities. First, there is, again, my personal favorite, federal program monitoring. And this is the state process for meeting their responsibility to monitor federal program requirements at the local educational agencies. It also includes some state restricted programs, and LEAs are selected based on risk assessment. Then there's state audits. These annual audits of state-funded programs are conducted by outside auditors based on requirements in the state audit guide, which is updated annually. And then there are federal audits. These are conducted in conjunction with the state audit process. The guide for federal audits is the compliance supplement, which is updated annually by the OMB. And you can follow this link for the 2023 compliance supplement. And lastly, there are inspector general audits. And this is conducted by the federal OIG for education. And they are usually based on issues identified for possible misuse of federal funds. And so these are really interesting because these are the ones where we are notified, or we see pictures of superintendents getting handcuffed because they've misused the funds. So again, these are all of the monitoring processes that are in place. And so before we move on, I am so sorry I did not introduce myself. I am Adrienne Balcazar, and today I'm here with the whole team, and I want to formally introduce all of them. We have Rachel Garcia, we have Anita Lomeli, We have Augustine Garcia, new to our team, and Jeannie Keith, Helen Choi, and oh my gosh, Debbie Cano. And we have Maribel as well. So our whole team is really happy to be here with you. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Anita to go over some terminology.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Cost allocation terminology. In the next slides, we will review some terminology that is critical for both the fiscal side and the program side of the house to understand. And this in order to create cohesiveness and mutual respect for each other's requirements. To begin our terminology learning, let's take direct costs for 200. That was a little Jeopardy fun for you this afternoon to begin our section. Direct costs are defined in 2 Code of Federal Regulations 200.413. Direct costs are those that can be identified specifically with a particular program and cost objective. And direct costs may be instructional, such as a teacher and curriculum provided for an intervention program, or administrative, but only if certain conditions are met. These conditions will be discussed in an upcoming slide.
I think we lost her. Okay.
Can I come in? Yes. Okay, hi everyone. Okay, it must be the rain. Let's see. Did I go over direct costs?
You're on, yeah.
I'm okay, let's see.
The cost must directly benefit the program.
Okay, and so these costs must directly benefit the program from which it is funded. And lastly, direct costs are associated with specific program codes. Next slide, please. Okay, so some typical examples of direct costs are compensation, including salaries, wages, and fringe benefits of personnel working on the award or the grant, the cost of trainings or professional development essential for the program, cost of materials and supplies necessary for the purpose of the program, and equipment that may need to be purchased specifically to benefit and to be used in the implementation of the program. Remember, equipment costing over $500 should be inventoried and tracked. Associated with direct costs are direct services. And when defining direct services, it's critical to note that direct services are typically delivered at the school site. Direct services occur when the student is the direct recipient or the beneficiary of the service provided through, for example, professional development or parent involvement. Direct services may be provided to students by personnel such as teachers, specialists, resource teachers, school nurses, school librarians, and instructional aides. Equipment such as computers and/or software may be a direct service to students if they meet the educational needs of eligible students as supported by student data and effective practice. So how would one go about determining what qualifies as a direct service? Expenditures for personnel or services are justified as a direct service when the following are true. 1, personnel are providing direct, hands-on instruction to students. 2, services provided are integral to the instructional program, so much so that in its absence, the quality of the instruction itself and the academic success of students would be adversely affected. 3, the funds are used to purchase instructional materials and equipment to be used by eligible students. And 4, funds expended support the analysis and the use of student performance data that then is used to inform instruction for eligible students. If you can answer yes to these questions when trying to decipher whether a service is a direct service to students, then you can feel justified in your expenditures and decision. So moving on to the next category for 400, we have administrative costs. Any costs that are administrative in nature and support the management of a program are considered to be administrative costs. but buyer beware. Costs of program administration may be direct or indirect depending on how they are described in the law. For example, salaries of program administrators who conduct program monitoring, prepare program plans, and purchase program-specific equipment and supplies may be considered direct costs if allowed under specific programs. Indirect administrative costs relate to costs of the personnel division or department, payroll preparation, accounting, and procurement systems. Always be sure to check what is allowed, including percentage for total administrative costs for programs under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Program or awards may specify what percentage may be charged to direct or indirect administrative costs. Next slide, please. And even when you think you have a good understanding of direct and indirect costs, you may find yourself questioning some administrative and clerical costs that fall into this gray area, if you will. Grant guidance tells us that salaries of administrative and clerical staff should normally be treated as indirect costs. But nevertheless, there is a caveat explained in 2 CFR 200.413C. In those instances, categorizing the salaries of administrative and clerical staff as direct costs only applies if all 4 of these conditions on this slide are met. First, the administrative and clerical services are integral to a project or activity. Next, individuals involved can be specifically identified with the project or activity. Also, such costs are explicitly explained in the budget or have prior written approval of the federal awarding agency. And lastly, the costs are not also recovered as indirect costs. No double dipping allowed. Taking time to determine these costs as indirect or direct is important in order to ensure that all costs are expended within the parameters of the program or grant. Next, we have the indirect costs and indirect cost rate. So indirect costs are agency-wide, general management costs. They support the implementation of the program, grant, or award, but cannot quite be directly attributed to the grant. They support the implementation of the program. General management costs consist of administrative activities necessary for the operation of the LEA, such as accounting, budgeting, cost of the personnel division or department, payroll preparation, purchasing and procurement systems, and centralized data processing, as mentioned in the previous slide. Indirect costs are more global in nature, but enter an indirect cost rate. An indirect cost rate is the percentage of an organization's indirect cost to its indirect cost and is a standardized method of charging individual programs for their share of indirect costs. An estimate of indirect cost is reserved at the beginning of the year and then trued up at the end of the year based on how much funding was actually expended in indirect costs. The California Department of Education calculates the indirect cost rate for each LEA as authorized by the U.S. Department of Education. The first link listed on this slide takes you to the web page with the spreadsheet that lists all of the LEAs in the state and their indirect cost rate. Procedure 915 in the California School Accounting Manual, affectionately known as CSAM, provides comprehensive instructions related to the indirect cost rate for those who deal with the LEA's budget most intimately. And nevertheless, it is a great resource for those on the program side to have downloaded. The link is provided for you to understand what and how accounting principles and procedures are handled in California schools. In all, remember that each LEA has an indirect cost rate that it must adhere to for its federal grants and awards. Each LEA's rate is different and varies by school year. The list provided by CDE and the CSAM are good resources to have handy. Also important to note is that legislative cap on administrative costs for federal programs specific for the award or grant. In the case of Title I, Part A, California's Ed Code 63001 specifically states that LEAs will spend no less than 85% of funds received from specific categorical programs, including Title I, Part A, at school sites for direct services to students. Maximum allowable for administrative cost, including indirect cost, is 15%. And although the 85-15 rule in relation to Title I, Part A is not federal law, it is California's law. It's always a good idea to take a look at the federal programs you're in charge of to identify the maximum administrative and indirect costs that can be charged to the program. And lastly, we have centralized services. A centralized service is a term generally used in relation to Title I, Part A programs. A centralized service is an activity funded by a school's allocation, but administered by the LEA's central office or district office. And even though the services may be directed by the LEA and possibly housed at the central office, the services are provided directly to the students at the school site. Centralized services may be direct services or administrative in nature. But please note, if it is part of the school's allocation, it must be approved by school site council and included in the SIPSA. For Title I, a centralized service that is a direct service may be taken after a school allocation has been made or as a district reservation prior to the school's allocation. And if staff funded by the school allocation conducts administrative duties, whether those duties are centralized or not, that portion of their salary that is administrative must be charged to the 15% indirect services in Title I, Part A per Ed Code 63001. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. And next up is Jeannie Keith.
Thanks so much, Anita. The next section addresses cost principles. All right, so this afternoon, we're going to focus on one section to specifically address cost principles. These principles are found in the Code of Federal Regulations, and the link on the slide takes you to the section on the U.S. Department of Education's website that includes uniform guidance included in Section 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations. 2 CFR Part 200 establishes uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards to non-federal entities. The cost principles in Section 200.400 are particularly important for anyone working with federal programs, including anyone signing off on expenditures, because they are a key factor in determining if a cost can be charged to an award. And everything outlined in the cost principles has to be met for the cost to be allowable. So the cost principles provide the rules for determining allowability of costs. You will see the principles are used in monitoring offices or by monitoring offices and reviewers, particularly for Title I. And because the program is so broad, they look to the cost principles to address specific areas to be looked at. It is important to know that this guidance applies to all federal grants. So the cost principles are the first cut at determining allowability. In addition to cost principles, one must always look at specific grant requirements. Next slide, please. So this section starts with the message that it is the responsibility of the non-federal entity to follow cost principles. The non-federal entity is you, the LEA. This message sets the foundation for the requirements about cost principles. These principles are based on the presumption that the LEA is responsible for administering funds consistent with program requirements and objectives, and that the LEA must use sound organization and management techniques to ensure the funds are managed properly and efficiently. It's your responsibility through your sound management practices that you assume responsibility when someone signs off on the assurances in the Con App, that you will follow the specific rules of the grant. You will see the LEA responsibility applies overall to all of the cost principles. This section goes on to say that adherence to cost principles really shouldn't require LEAs to change their systems, but their systems really should be such that they ensure appropriate internal accounting policies and practices that support and document allowable expenditures of all funds. And that may be the case in your LEA. But what this means is that the federal law is not going to tell you how to do it, but it tells you what the LEA needs to do. Next slide, please. This is a list of requirements included in the cost principles. The first three are foundational, but take thoughtful consideration to apply. Necessary, reasonable, and allocable, included in red, are the top three that may raise questions for reviewers, and these carry the most weight for determining allowability. Unlike other federal programs, there isn't a list of allowable uses for Title I. So these three cost principles are especially critical for determining allowability in this program. For others on the list, some of these make sense when you just read them, but others need some explanation. This afternoon, we'll look at all of the principles that are included as we go on to the next slides. So as we look at what's included in the cost principles, it's important to emphasize that these principles are your key to determining the allowable costs for all federal grants. Application addresses how principles apply to determining allowable costs. So to answer questions about whether a cost is allowable for a specific award, LEAs need to follow these principles to determine the answers. Application is set up front and makes it clear that the LEAs need to use these principles as a first cut in determining allowable costs. So let's look closer at the first factor to consider affecting allowability of costs. Necessary. Is it necessary? To be allowable, a cost must be necessary for the performance of the grant. That means it's needed to achieve a program objective. So first, you need to know what the program objectives are. And this is often the basis for problems with determining allowability. You may receive questions such as, can I spend this money for this particular item of cost? For these questions, it's critical to ask why the cost is being considered, and specifically, what program objective does it support, and where are those objectives defined? To determine the cost is necessary, you need to know why and how the items of cost are aligned or connected to achieving the program objective. In some cases, program objectives are in various school plans. But where are other programs described? For example, where's Title II, III, and IV described? And where are the program objectives defined? This is critical to know so you can determine whether a cost is necessary to support a specific program. For Title I school-wide schools, program objectives and strategies are critical components of the SPSA. And that's why the SPSA is where you look to determine that a cost is necessary or not. So to answer these questions about what is necessary, you will need to be able to answer from the program side using the SPSA. If it's necessary, it must be clear that the plan includes the objective and strategy that the cost will support. That is why the SPSA needs to be clear and specific. Sometimes the question about what is necessary may overlap with what is reasonable. The question often surfaces if a particular item of cost that is a higher priced item is necessary to carry out the program, or could a lower priced item be used? For example, 2 technology items may be considered for a particular program. Purchasing the higher priced item has more sophisticated capabilities than what is necessary to implement the specific program. So that would not be necessary, nor would it be a reasonable cost. Next slide, please. Reasonableness. Here we're looking at another factor considering allowability. Reasonableness is a fiscal consideration. The guidance indicates factors to use in determining reasonableness. In determining if the expenditure is reasonable, one needs to consider what a prudent person would pay for the item of cost. The big idea is, would a reasonable person pay that much? The LEA must also consider several questions to determine reasonableness of costs. The first is market price for items of cost for comparable goods and services. The question to ask is if what you're paying for is comparable to the cost for the same or similar item. Or might you go down the street or to another vendor and get it for a lot less? Are you dealing with someone because you like that company or are treating them with a preference rather than responsibly using your federal funds and finding the right market price? The second question of cost, of reasonableness to consider, is the item considered ordinary and necessary for the operation or performance of the program? In other words, is this a typical thing that you would see in a school or used in a school to perform the program objective? For example, is a mahogany desk really reasonable, and is it something that's ordinary and necessary? Or could you suffice with perhaps a more modest model or more modest desk? And the third question addresses procurement procedures. Did you follow your own procurement procedures that you have for considering bids on certain items? Or did you just select the item of cost from one vendor? Are you following your own procedures? Districts can have compliance findings because they didn't follow their own procurement procedures. They may have had them written down, but nobody knew about them or nobody followed them. And another area where the reasonable test is applied is for administrative caps for programs that don't have a legislative cap. In those cases, for programs such as Title II, if you exceed a certain percentage in the consolidated application, you may be questioned based on the reasonableness of those costs. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so in considering reasonableness of costs, the prudent person test considers the circumstances prevailing at the time. So a cost might be higher under certain conditions. For example, during COVID, it was hard to get things. So some costs had gone up for some items. So a prudent person would determine if the costs are reasonable under specific circumstances or if the cost is excessive. So when one shows good and careful judgment when handling practical matters, they may be described as prudent. Similarly, a wise and well thought through investment decision or action can be called prudent. Another way to consider the prudent person's standard is to consider questions such as, are you spending your federal money the same way you are spending your state money? And are you spending your federal money the same way you would spend money out of your own pocket? It's important to maintain documentation of how the prudent person test was applied for expenditures that are allocable to the program paying for the cost. Next slide, please. Another key principle to be considered is how the cost is allocable to the program. What allocable means is that the LEA, that's you, can show that the cost results in benefit to the program that is paying for the cost. So asking why you would pay for this item or service with this particular program dollar is an essential question. For example, did the cost support the strategies planned to address low-performing students and achievement gaps that are being addressed in a particular program? In considering direct administrative costs and multi-funded positions or other costs, the cost, duty statements, and time and effort reports need to directly support the program objectives in order to be allocable to the program. Next slide, please. And here we're looking at highlighting some additional federal cost principles. For example, not prohibited under state or local law means you can't do something that's illegal in your state with federal money. And sometimes, as you've heard before, some state or local laws may be more restrictive. Treated consistently means that policies and procedures must be applied in the same manner when reviewing, negotiating, or approving direct or indirect costs, so that variations in the treatment of costs using federal funds do not occur as compared to cost considerations using other funding sources. The LEA must apply the same rules, procedures to federal funds as other funds. You can't apply different rules to your federal money. A cost may not be assigned also to a federal award as a direct cost if any other cost incurred for the same purpose in like circumstances has been allocated to the federal award as an indirect cost. Additionally, adequately documented means making sure you have documentation for expenditures budgeted and reconciled, and documentation for following procurement procedures. Documentation must be maintained for a minimum of 3 years, although 5 years is recommended. Not included as a match refers to not including costs or matching requirements of any other federally financed programs. And finally, net of applicable credits refers to any reductions of budgeted expenditures that reduce the actual expense or payment for items that are allocable to a specific federal award. In these situations, any credits received or reductions in cost must be credited to the federal award and not to another funding source or to the general fund. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at an additional component included in the Code of Regulations. And this includes a section that addresses selected items of cost. This section includes an alphabetized list of 55 items of costs and provides principles to be applied in establishing allowability for these costs. This section includes costs such as advertising, memberships and subscriptions, maintenance, repair, and travel costs. It also includes items such as compensation, which include a section on standards for documentation of personnel expenses. This is where references to time and effort reporting can be found. It is really important to note that while the principles regarding items of costs are included here in this section, these principles reflect only one factor that needs to be considered, since allowability of costs must be considered in the context of the program and the provisions of the specific federal award. And as you've heard before today, the program requirements may provide additional guidance that must be considered when determining if an expenditure is allowable within the conditions of the grant. Next slide, please. So here we look at a selected item of cost. 200.438 addresses entertainment. This item is very clear. Costs of entertainment, including amusement, diversion, and social activities, and associated costs are unallowable. While the item notes, except where specific costs have a programmatic purpose, we have not seen a connection for entertainment to programmatic purpose. So entertainment should not be included using federal funds. On the next slide, two additional examples are offered that illustrate where a cost is unallowable and where conditions may apply to considering the item of cost. You can see student activity costs are not allowable. And for the second item, you can see some considerations for advertising and public relations may be considered, such as for recruitment of personnel or procurement of goods or service that is specific to meeting the requirements of the federal grant. It's important to share that the selected items of cost section also includes a discussion that notes the failure to mention a particular item of cost in this list of costs doesn't mean that those other items are allowable or unallowable. Rather, it means that to determine allowability in each case, it must be based on treatment provided for similar or related items of cost, and it must be based on the overall principles for determining allowability of costs. You'll want to take some time to familiarize yourself with this section. Our presentation will now address federal timelines.
Thank you, Jeannie. Good afternoon. In this section, we'll be discussing federal timelines and availability for federal funds. So let's delve into the timelines associated with state and federal funds. It's essential to understand these timelines. Most state programs typically do not have a deadline for spending funds or carryover limitations. The funds in these programs can roll over, especially in the case of ongoing programs. There are exceptions with these state programs, which are those state programs created through legislation with specific requirements and legislated time periods. Another crucial point to remember, particularly concerning state funds allocated under Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF, is that any funds budgeted to increase or improve services for EL, foster youth, and the low-income students must be carried over to increase or improve services for the same group of students in the following year. Importantly, this requirement does not limit the amount of time the LEAs have the access to the funds. This ensures that the resources are consistently directed towards enhancing educational outcomes. In contrast, federal funds, unlike most state funds, have defined spending timelines referred to as the obligation period. For most federal programs, the obligation period spans 27 months, which places a clear limit on when these funds must be committed to their designated purposes. In addition, it is important to note that Title I, Part A, is unique among federal programs, as it imposes a carryover limit, necessitating that the LE spend at least 85% of the funds in the first year. For all other federal funds, the full 27-month timeline is available for committing 100% of the allocated funds. Understanding these timelines is crucial for effective planning and resource allocation. For Title I Part A funds, an LEA is entitled to access Title I Part A funds for a full 15 months until September 30th before the limitation on carryover funds applies. Please note that September 30th is the end of the federal fiscal year. 12 months available to spend your allocated funds, with the federal requirements being that funds should be obligated by September 30th. We will discuss what obligation means later in this presentation. Now, typically, you might wonder why we have 27 months to spend federal funds. The reason behind the extended timeline is forward funding. This means that even though the funds are appropriated in the fall, the clock doesn't start ticking until the following spring when the LEs gain access to the funds. In essence, you have money available for 1 year, but thanks to the Tidings Amendment, you get an extra year. It's important to highlight the difference between federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year, which resulted in the extended 20 months period instead of the standard 24 months. This is all due to the first in, first out method, which plays a crucial role in this process. An LEA is allowed to carry over a portion of their allocated Title I funds from one fiscal year to the next. This amount, however, must not exceed 15% of the total Title I funds designated for the LEA in that fiscal year. It's important to note that this 15% limit does not include any funds carried over from the preceding year. CDE may grant a waiver of the 15% limitation, but only do so once every 3 years. If an LEA wishes to apply for such a waiver, they can do so through the Winter CONAP process. The reason behind this limitation is to ensure that the funds allocated for a specific year are primarily used to benefit the students of that same year. This practice helps maintain a focus on current educational needs. And again, remember, the 15% LEA limitation for Title I is all about making sure this year's funds are spent for this year's students. And now Augustine will continue with this section.
All righty, thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Helen previously mentioned, there's a federal requirement with a 27-month window ending on September 30th. We've also learned that the minimum percentage of funds that an LEA must expend or obligate each year by September 30th is 85%, and that the amount of funds that may carry over for 1 year is 15%. So let's take a look at the example on the screen. In this example, if the LEA's total 22-23 allocation was $1 million, then the minimum amount to expend or obligate by September 30th, 2023 was $850,000, or 85% of $1 million. The amount that this LEA may carry over to expend and obligate for an additional 12 months would be $150,000, or 15% of $1 million. Unspent Title I Part A carryover funds, as long as they're at or below the allowable 15% threshold, remain accessible for obligation by the LEA for an additional fiscal year. And this is in accordance with SS Section 1127A. These unspent Title I Part A funds can include funds reserved for specific purposes but were not utilized, funds retained for LEA-wide direct student services, and funds allocated to a specific school or schools. Please note, though, that the 15% carryover limitation does not apply if the LEA allocation, including funds transferred in from other federal programs, is less than $50,000 for the fiscal year. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Title I Part A carryover waiver. LEAs complete the Title I Part A LEA carryover data collection form in the CARS Con app during the winter release to report expenditures and obligations through September 30th. Once the expenditure and obligation amounts are entered into the form and the form is saved, the system calculates the carryover dollar amount and the percentage. If the LEAs have a carryover greater than 15% and is eligible to apply for a waiver, the waiver request section will display in the Title I Part A LEA carryover form when the form is saved. So let's explore this eligibility timeline for a sample waiver of the carryover limitation. If, for instance, the LEA's waiver for the carryover was granted and approved during the 21-22 fiscal year, the next opportunity for the LEA to apply for such a waiver could be in the 24-25 fiscal year. This is because, like Helen mentioned, the State Board of Education has the authority to waive the carryover limitation once every 3 years. On a side note, it's important that the Title I Part A LEA carryover data collection form be completed during the CARS winter release by the dates published by the CARS office. All right, quiz time. If my LEA applied and the waiver was approved for in fiscal year 22-23, for which fiscal year may my LEA next apply for a carryover waiver? Let's hit that chat. Thank you. I see a lot of people selecting the correct answer. And let's see. Next slide, please. That's right. The correct answer is C. any LEA that received a waiver of the carryover limitation in section 1127A from the SEA for its fiscal year 22-23, well, those Title I funds would next be eligible for a waiver of the carryover limitation during the 25-26 fiscal year. All right, so when it comes to equitable services for private schools, in accordance with ESSA, funds should be used in the current year, and any carryover for equitable services needs to be used for equitable services the following year. Now, there may be some extenuating circumstances in which an LEA is unable to obligate all the funds within this time frame in a responsible manner. Under these circumstances, the funds may remain available for the provision of equitable services under the respective program during the subsequent school year. In addition, in determining how such carryover funds will be used, the LEA must consult with appropriate private school officials. It's worth noting that if the district exceeds the 15% carryover limit and the CDE subsequently reduces the allocation, well, this reduction cannot be subtracted from the amount reserved for equitable services. Therefore, it's crucial to ensure the timely utilization of these funds. All right, and since we know that the obligation period is the timeline for spending federal funds, let's take a look at when an obligation is made. This table shows when a state or a subgrantee makes obligations for various kinds of property and services. The guidelines for these obligations are outlined in 34 CFR 76.707, and we've included a direct link to this regulation on this slide for your reference. Now, what you see in this chart is a breakdown of when a state or a subgrantee needs to make these obligations for various types of property and services. This information becomes increasingly vital as you approach the end of the obligation period. For example, if the obligation pertains to personal services provided by a contractor who's not an employee, the obligation is made on the date when the grantee makes a binding written commitment to obtain the services. On the other hand, if it's related to travel, the obligation is fulfilled when the travel actually occurs. Well, why is this important, you might wonder? Well, these obligations count toward the amount you spend in a given year, and this can help you manage your carryover or prevent you from exceeding the timeline for fund expenditure. Following the obligation, you have a 90-day window to liquidate the funds. In simpler terms, to liquidate means to settle the bill. So when you have a binding agreement or a contract to pay for a service, the actual payment constitutes the liquidation. And this payment must occur within that 90-day period. And finally, please keep this in mind. Under Title V of ESSA, LEAs have the flexibility to transfer funds, but there are a few rules to follow. You can transfer funds either between Title II and Title IV, or move them from these programs into Title I and Title III. However, it's important to note that for Title I and Title III funds, yeah, you have the ability to transfer into these programs, but you cannot transfer funds out of them. Understanding the nature of restricted funds is essential. Title I and Title III are considered your most restricted funds, and this means you can transfer funds into them, but you cannot transfer funds out of these programs. This information is documented in the CONAP, but what's crucial to clarify is that indicating in the CONAP that funds will be transferred at the state level simply notifies the CDE of your intent to transfer the funds. It does not execute the actual transfer. So when you decide to transfer funds, it's important to understand that the transfer must occur at the district level when the funds arrive at your district. So indicating your intent in the application is not the same as the funds being automatically moved. For example, if you transfer Title IV funds to Title I, they will initially arrive at your district as Title IV funds, and it's up to the LEA to complete the transfer and document it in the CONAP. This information is important because some districts can mistakenly assume that the transfer is complete as soon as they indicate it in the CONAP, leading to potential issues such as excessive carryover if the transfer is not executed at the district level. So that concludes our section, and I'll turn it over to Rachel for federal cash management data collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustine. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So as Augustine mentioned, in this next section, we're going to discuss the federal cash management data collection, which is also known as CMDC. So the cash management data collection system, or the CMDC, is a web-based data collection application for LEAs to report their federal cash management data for federal programs under the Every Student Succeeds Act. LEAs receiving Title I, II, III, and/or Title IV funds are required to report the cash balance for each of these programs on a quarterly basis to the CDE through the CMDC system in order to receive their apportionments for those specific programs. And federal regulations require that the receipt of federal funds minimize the time elapsing between the receipt and the expenditure of federal funds. And so the CMDC system provides the CDE with the data needed to make apportionments based on the LEA's cash balance as required by these regulations. Now, only one CMDC report is submitted each quarter. The CMDC report will have a separate line to report the cash balance for each of the programs. And the programs and lines shown for a particular LEA's CMDC will correspond to the programs that the LEA is receiving funding for. This reporting is usually completed by someone in the fiscal office. Next slide, please. The CMDC is important because the CDE will use the reported cash balance to determine the apportionment to release in each reporting period. The apportionment will be equal to 25% of the LEA's annual program entitlement minus the cash balance it reported for that specific period. And so calculations will be done for each of the federal programs. Data submitted in the CMDC system does not affect how program entitlements are calculated, only how much of the LEA's entitlement will be paid each quarter. So basically, LEAs will not receive apportionments if they are not spending at least 25% of the funds each quarter. And the CDE sends out apportionments approximately 1 month after the closing day of the preceding reporting window. So here we see the CMDC reporting dates. And so there are 4 reporting periods for CMDC. And so as you can see in the chart on the slide, the deadline for reporting period 2 just passed a few weeks ago on October 31st. LEAs must submit cash management data each period to be eligible to receive funds in that specific period. And the data must be submitted by midnight on the reporting deadline. And keep in mind that the CDE does not accept late submissions. So if an LEA does not submit a CMDC report for a specific reporting period, the CDE will not apportion funds to that LEA for that period. And the LEA would have to wait until the next reporting period to submit the CMDC data in order to receive an apportionment. It's also important to note that if the cash balance is 0, a CMDC report must still be submitted in order to receive an apportionment for that period. So here on this slide, we've included a few resources for your reference, including a link to the CMDC logon page and the instructions for reporting this data. And we've also included a link to some CMDC FAQs that are posted on the CDE's website. So here are just a few things to consider regarding the cash management data collection. So how are program staff tracking spending at the district level, as well as at the school level? Who in your business office completes the CMDC reporting? Also, who ensures the CMDC reports are accurate? Who is checking to make sure apportionments are coming on time? And finally, what communication systems are in place to ensure communication between program and fiscal staff, as well as between district and school level staff? One additional reminder we wanted to provide is that all LEAs receiving federal advances are required to calculate, report, and remit interest earned to the CDE. And so it's important to keep in mind that this is in addition to the CMDC reporting. The interest due on federal cash balances should reflect the actual amount of interest earned on the unspent federal program advances. Interest must be calculated and reported to the CDE on a quarterly basis by email, and the information reported must specify the amount of interest due or 0 if there is no interest due. LEAs are allowed to retain up to $500 of interest earned each year in total for related administrative expenses. And so it's important to keep in mind that this $500 is in total of all federal funds received, and it's not $500 per program. Another important thing to keep in mind is that interest remitted to the CDE is immediately sent to the U.S. Department of Education. So you want to ensure that calculations and payments are accurate prior to submission, because refunds or credits are not allowed. And at the bottom of this slide, we've included a few links to some CDE resources related to interest earned on federal funds. And so that concludes this section. I will now turn it over to Debbie for internal controls and policies and procedures.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. So we will be wrapping up this training for today with internal controls, policies, and procedures. This information is critical to the fiscal and program department partnership as you oversee your state and federal programs. Next slide, please. Internal controls. So what is this and what does it mean? This is something included in the Code of Federal Regulations. And internal controls is described as a process implemented by a non-federal entity, that would be the LEA, to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the objectives to offer effectiveness and efficiency in operations, reliability of reporting for internal and external use, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Our internal controls support these outcomes. And developing internal controls begins by assessing risk that the LEA faces. And every LEA is different. You know your specific issues that your LEA or your district may face. If there's been a lot of turnover in the central office, that might be a risk factor. Or if you have a new program that you're implementing, again, something that you would have to develop internal controls for. So it's really a very specific look at your LEA and what your programs and your internal controls are considered now. Next slide, please. The purpose of internal controls is to ensure that agencies meet program objectives and implement federal programs in compliance with the legal requirements by assessing potential risk specific to the LEA and implementing the district systems to ensure that you prevent, detect, or correct any issues of waste, fraud, or abuse. So you want to be proactive to prevent. But if there's something happening, you need to be able to detect that and correct it. You don't want to have any kind of waste, fraud, or abuse. And your internal controls, if they are strong, will be able to prevent, and then you don't have to detect or correct. Next slide, please. So standards for internal controls are provided from federal government. The Office of Comptroller General of the United States provide the standards for internal controls in the federal government. And they state the non-federal entity must maintain controls that comply with the U.S. Constitution, federal statute, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the federal award. They evaluate and monitor the compliance with statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the award. They take prompt action when instances of non-compliance are identified. So internal controls are not an event, not a single event, but a series of actions that occur throughout an organization's operations. Internal control is recognized as an integral part of operational processes that management uses to guide its operations, rather than a separate system within an entity. So in this sense, the internal control is built as a part of the organizational structure to help managers achieve the organizational objective on an ongoing basis. Next slide. So the Government of Accountability Office does produce the standards for internal control guidance in the federal government. And this is a very detailed document that outlines 5 interrelated components, each with 17 correlated principles that detail best practices in the development and implementation of internal controls. So a control environment is the foundation for internal controls. It provides the discipline and structure to help an entity achieve its objective. Risk assessment assesses the risk facing the entity as it seeks to achieve its objectives. This assessment provides the basis for developing appropriate risk responses. Control activities are the actions management establishes through policies and procedures to achieve objectives and respond to risk in the internal control system, which includes the entity's information system. Information and communication is the quality information management and personnel communicate, and it used to support the internal control system. Monitoring activities establish and operate to assess the quality of the performance over time and promptly resolving any findings in an audit or other reviews. Next slide. So internal controls in you. So really understanding what internal controls are and what they are not. Make sure your work is aligned with requirements and not adding additional stress, burden, or undue complexity. Management establishes the internal control. Employees must know and understand what their responsibilities are and how their actions contribute to and affect the overall system and their discrete duties. You standardize your process, you follow procedures and document operational activities. Having personal ownership is taking responsibility for your specific role and communicating any challenges to management. Your group effort is that everyone is responsible for implementing strong internal controls in their daily work. And value, creating meaning and purpose in the work so that executing the process is ingrained in the staff culture and is not viewed as burdensome or time-consuming. Next slide. So continuing on with this internal controls in your role. So establishing responsibility to know who is supposed to be doing what, the key tasks that need to be assigned to specific individuals and communicating across the agency. Segregate duties is to create and checks a system of checks and balances to avoid theft, fraud, or impropriety. Restrict access, meaning access should be given only to those who need it to complete their assigned duties. And document procedures and transactions. Always retain documentation, electronic and manually, and then independently verify, corroborate information. Internal controls need to be built in as a part of the organizational structure again, and to help manage and achieve those objectives on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. Policies and procedures are a part of internal controls. Having compliant policies and procedures leads to administering programs in accordance with grant management requirements. They are important internal controls that help ensure programs are compliant, and they set the framework for compliance by instructing the readers on how programs are supposed to run and why. Policies and procedures allow the organization to cultivate an environment of compliance. Next slide. So what is the difference between a policy and a procedure? So a policy is why something is done, and a procedure is how something is done. The policy gives the standard, and the procedure gives us the steps. The policy's goals and formal directives of the organization it used to communicate to employees the desired outcome of the organization and may or may not require adoption by the governing board. Procedures are similar to ARs, or administrative regulations. They provide specific methods employed in the day-to-day operations of the organization to ensure that the policy goals are met. Procedures do not require board approval. They should not be a reiteration of the requirements or of the policy. They should be a step-by-step process needed to achieve the goal. What is going to happen in the steps of process? Who will carry these actions out? Who will oversee? What is the timeline? Those are the procedures. A flow chart is a really nice part of the procedure as well. Next step, please, or next slide, please. The LEA does have a requirement to have policies and procedures, some of which are listed here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but our LEAs, we do have administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for our federal awards, and the required policies and procedures, which are included this list and not including but not limited to this list here. We're going to go over a few of those. Next slide. Procurement policies and procedures. So we're going to briefly discuss some items that are most critical to our work as with the state and federal oversight. Procurement is just how you purchase items. Procedures for awarding contracts and hiring contractors. This is critical. This is an item where there is potential for issue. If you don't follow procedures, then how do you select? Micro purchases, are they distributed equitably among suppliers? When ordering, do you always go to the same place? Do you always order from Staples instead of Office Depot? If so, why? So your procedures need to outline the steps and what you do and how you do it. Small purchases, quotations from at least 2 vendors. Who does this work and how is it done? How is it documented? Bid process. The objective process, open versus sealed. Are you getting quotes? How do you select? If the vendor is a sole source, that's the only person you can get that specific service or product from, how is that determined? Are you documenting that? Is there an evaluation criteria for bids? And are decisions made by more than one person or one person, and how is that person selected? Consider the conflicts of interest for employees involved in selection of awards and administration of contracts. Is someone's relative working for the company? Will someone be getting a free trip if they are able to secure a contract for a vendor or be given free merchandise? I know I have been sent an iPad in a different position. I had to give it back. So gifts with purchases are not a good idea. So those type of things are considered conflict of interest and not advised. Contract administration, ensuring contractors perform in accordance with their terms of conditions and specific for their contract. So if you have ever worked with a contractor to do work in your home, you know that your contract should detail the work to be done, and payment isn't given in full until the work is completed and is to specification. The same thing goes with your LEA. So, and who is the person who oversees that and checks that the work is being done to specification? And again, procedures to avoid acquisition of duplicate or unnecessary items. How are you ensuring that when you're purchasing something, it's not already sitting in a warehouse? If we need to buy 5 tables, how do we know that there aren't 5 tables sitting in boxes at a different school site? So these things are very critical and important to consider. Next slide, please. Allowability policies and procedures. This is from that list that really involves both program and fiscal offices. The LEA needs written procedures for determining the allowability of costs in accordance with subpart E of the cost principles of this part and the terms of conditions of the federal award. And what should that include? The factors used to determine allowability, who are the staff involved in making determinations, and the approval process for expenditures. So our next slide gives us questions to consider for allowability, and these are also included in our fiscal handbook mentioned at the beginning of our presentation. So the questions to consider for allowability: who creates the budget for each federal program? How does that happen? Is that program or fiscal, or you do it together? Who verifies allowability for each cost under the federal program and the uniform grant guidance? Whose job is it to say this or that this is or is not allowable? When cost changes occur within a program, who's notified? Is someone working in the business office and then just makes that change without mentioning it to somebody? And communication breakdown can cause serious issues. So when cost changes are identified, what is the timeline for submitting budget amendments and who's notified? Who's responsible for generating supporting documentation, demonstrating a cost is reasonable, necessary, and allocable? Where is that documentation kept? How is it kept? Who identifies each funded staff person with the statute of single or multiple cost objectives? For staff who are funded under multiple cost objectives, how is the amount of time budgeted for each program determined? What documentation or process is used to support the amount of budgeted, and who verifies the accuracy? So the who, what, where, when, and how questions should be clear to all. The roles and responsibilities need to be understood, and they're not owned by one person. Good systems work independent of individuals. With good systems in place, a new person should be able to access the policies and procedures and understand their role in a system. These are all considerations as you review and revise your policies. And here we go. Next slide. For time and effort, no, we were back at time and effort. There we go. The Code of Federal Regulations 200.430I, as we shared earlier in our presentation, LEAs must establish written policies and procedures for documenting time and effort of employees that work on federal programs. The document should include the LEA specific policies and procedures for documenting the actual hours worked, including related internal controls, employee training, reconciliation processes, and deadlines. So refer to that section 200.430I for requirements and documenting time and effort. Next slide, please. And lastly, I want to leave you with considering what happened with policies and procedures when the pandemic hit. Consider, do your policies and procedures reflect current context? Are your policies prepared for an emergency? If COVID taught us anything, it was that we needed to make sure that our policies we would be able to work our system within the policies, and we have to change policies if an emergency occurs. So just a reminder, to be allowable, salaries and wages must be documented per the LEA's policies and procedures. And they should include policies and procedures for paying and documenting compensation under unexpected or extraordinary circumstances. And I just want to leave you with the idea that this workshop is a lot of critical and compliance legal requirements, which can feel heavy and overwhelming. But I would like to leave you with a reminder to never lose sight of the connection to who these laws are intended to serve. All of this oversight is intended to ensure that students are being served. High quality policies, procedures, and internal controls will support the implementation of quality instructional programs for our students. And that concludes our day one, and we're going to leave the question and answer open in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please put those in there now. Next slide. want to remind you that our part 2 of our fiscal training will be Wednesday, November 29th, same time, 3 to 4:30. And next slide, we have our evaluation for today's workshop. We appreciate your feedback, and we definitely use this feedback to guide our future planning. So if you could take a moment to complete that, we would appreciate it. And of course, if you need to contact our office or any one of us, our contact information is here on the slide. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it.